Britain continues to make headway against the depression.
Modern industrial nations have sinews of steel.
I have come here to ask, not for gold, but for steel.
Throughout history, in uncertain times, something as solid as steel has provided a sort of comfort, creating jobs during the Depression, forging a country's weapons during war, building homes and connecting a country with cars and railways. Well, today we live in uncertain times, and the British steel industry is at something of a crossroads, with a major plant at risk of closing. The government has shown how important it thinks this is by recalling Parliament back to this building behind me during the Easter break and stepping in to keep the plant running. Now, recalling Parliament is not something done lightly. In my case, I was recalled twice in 5 years over riots in the summer of 2011 and on the question of whether the UK should take military action against Syria in 2013. Momentous occasions that drew MPs back from holiday destinations. In my case, America, disrupting everyone's plans at short notice. So, does steel really carry the same gravitas, and why? Our reporter, Liam Askin, looks at what steel means to the United Kingdom.
The future of British steel hangs in the balance. Jobs, investment, growth. Our economic and national security are all on the line.
For the first time in 43 years, MPs were summoned back to Parliament on a weekend during recess to save Britain's steel industry.
Extremely hard.
The government moved to keep a British steel plant in the Midlands from closing. Its Beijing-based owners threatened to shut the blast furnaces, claiming the plant loses them over £700,000 a day. The site in Scunthorpe employs 3,500 people and is the only UK plant which makes virgin steel that's made from raw materials like iron ore and coal, as opposed to recycled metal.
So the government would argue that it's important as a strategic resource because steel is crucial in industries such as defence, for our national defence, and for nuclear reactors, which are going to be increasingly important for our electricity generation. So to have some capability in steel, they would argue, might reduce our concerns if there are countries such as China we're importing steel from, where we might have worries that relations might not be good in the future, and there may be a risk to supply.
From tanks and warships to wind turbines and rail lines, steel is essential. And as war rages in Eastern Europe and trade tensions rise in Asia, governments worldwide are scrambling to secure their supply chains. The industry has come under pressure from President Donald Trump's 25% tariff on imports into America, a tax designed to bring steel manufacturing jobs back to the US.
Because we never charged anybody anything, but now we're going to charge.
So how much steel do countries make these days? Let's look at some examples. In 2024, the UK produced over 5 million tonnes, equating to just 0.3% of the world's total. The EU accounted for 7% of the world's total. The US made 81 million tonnes, but China produced the most, over 1 billion tonnes, which is more than half of global steel production. In a world gripped by uncertainty, steel is becoming a symbol of national power and prosperity. Could steel even be the new arms race? And if so, is the UK losing?
Back in the studio, I'm joined by economist and former government advisor Vicky Pryce, former Business Minister Paul Scully, and political commentator Alicia Fitzgerald. Welcome to Westminster Watch. Paul, let me start with you. When the House of Commons meets under the circumstances of recall, you and I both know that there's a strong personal responsibility. You feel it's so unusual. You come in as an MP, most people are aware of what's going on, an awful lot of eyes are on you, and it's normally for very, very important issues. Was the recall of Parliament justified for the question of steel?
I agree with you that it should be only used at the very most important things. Usually it's if actually conflict and these kind of things. However, I think we were backed into a corner that it had to be recalled at this moment in time because there's no real plan at the moment about what we do with British Steel, and we are at an inflection point where the company that owned British Steel were looking to leave, and if the blast furnaces turn off, then it's really, if not impossible, very difficult to turn them back on again.
Do you see, there's part of me, Alicia, thinks that this was actually predictable, and that's why my question is saying, why did you have to have the drama of recall of Parliament? How did we get to this point, do you think?
I mean, it's British politics. Leave everything till the last minute until we're at absolute breaking crisis point and then call it as an emergency and pretend there was absolutely nothing that anyone could have done before this tipping point. I mean, I think that just begs a question more widely about politics and about the speed at which people pick up on issues that are brewing and developing, maybe potentially seeming as if they're just in the background until it gets to this absolute crisis emergency point, which is clearly what happened with this. And I think Paul's right in saying, yes, fine, it's not your usual reason behind recalling a parliament, but it was at the point where if these furnaces did run out of coal, they just would be unusable. So it was a make or break moment for Parliament this time round.
It feels like there wasn't a plan in the lead up to it, and there's not a plan now, but it was a decision that had to be made. So it's difficult times.
Well, Vicky, let me turn to you first of all. I mean, if those furnaces had been switched off and we didn't have steel production in the UK, just how significant is that?
Well, in reality, one could get the steel from somewhere else. And in fact, we do. We get an awful lot, particularly from Europe. And of course, we know that China has rather a lot of it, and we can get that one in quite cheaply. But I think there is another issue, which is the security of supply. And the way things are developing right now, the geopolitics, wars, President Trump, I think you do need to have a little bit of certainty as to where some of the quite substantial, important. It doesn't matter. It's tiny, isn't it? Well, you can. Nevertheless, it may look tiny in terms of the overall production, but it is. The British Steel, they do provide the steel that we need for the railways, for defence. So for the critical parts of the economy, the British Steel is really important. So if we didn't have that, then we would need to rely on imports from somewhere else.
So is it significant, Alicia? Because a lot of players put on this in the media that, you know, if we didn't have this steel production in the United Kingdom, we would be the only G7 advanced economy that was not a steel producer. Dare I say, so what?
I mean, yes, but I think given the fact we have a government who have labelled so many policies, I mean, increasing defence spending, infrastructure, house building targets, wanting to improve rail systems across the UK and our connectivity from north to south, all of these require an awful lot of steel. So it's kind of at odds with Labour's policies or just general government policies, regardless of who's in power. If at the same time you're wanting to ramp up these numbers and build all these houses, for example, but then you have actually nothing to be able to do it and you're relying on outside sources. And the trouble is, and I think we're noticing this now more than ever, the issue with being a standalone country and relying totally on everybody else means that if something bad does happen, a global event does happen, like we've seen recently with the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, you really are on your own. So any possible opportunity where you can produce something yourself and you have that, even if it's not your main source, and have it as a backup, it is really important and good to have.
It's interesting, Paul, because Vicky mentioned, not unreasonably, the question of our own defence capability and the importance of steel. But when I was looking into it, we still import something like 60% of our steel from Spain, from Germany, from France, to make those defence products that we need. We're not going to go to war with them, are we? So does our level
It's unlikely, and it's important to say that if British Steel closes down, if that blast furnace is closing down, we're talking about not producing virgin steel, so steel directly from iron ore. We still have to import the iron ore. We don't mine a lot of that these days in the UK, but we can do recycled steel through electric arc furnaces, although, and part of the problem with electric arc furnaces and why blast furnaces are difficult, we have the most expensive energy in the Western world, and so we've actually got to find a way of reducing that. But actually defence, even if we are importing that, we still make the steel for our nuclear submarines and for our nuclear power stations and for aircraft landing gear from Sheffield Forgemasters in an electric arc furnaces. So actually that sort of recycled steel can produce high grade steel as well.
Do you think it's the beginning of a step of picking up on Alicia's point that actually Trump has made us look to what we develop in our own countries, what we make in our own countries, and less what we import. Do you think we might start producing more steel and actually up the production levels here?
I think the interesting thing is not so much whether we produce it in this country. The question is it British in any sense? And what has happened is that we have privatised large parts of our infrastructure, which is now owned by foreign firms,
and
or
foreign national
quite
countries.
Often it's
yes.
companies, it's countries,
Yeah.
and that the state that owns some of those companies that are now running, our water supply or electricity. So I think there is now a rethink going on.
Let's take a look actually, because the news has been dominated by what's been going on with steel and the recall of Parliament. Let's listen to what some other people outside the studio think.
The people that work here, they need jobs and stuff like that. So if we could come to an agreement, China, that would go shishini. That's thank you in Chinese, by the way.
I think there are some specific things that you need virgin steel for. I think the idea of using electric arc furnaces is a really good one on environmental grounds, but I think overall there's some things we still need to be able to make in the UK.
I think it's a good thing the government stepped in. Hopefully it'll work out. Don't know how much it'll cost us, but I guess hopefully they'll tell us in time.
I think we have to have a degree of independence, and there's a lot of Chinese investment in this country, and it would probably be better to, given the climate in the world at the moment, to reduce that.
We shouldn't be dependent on other countries for everything that we need.
So you would support nationalisation?
To a degree, yes. I think certain things should not be put up for sale by governments.
Obviously, it's not profit making for the private sector, so is it going to be a good idea to nationalise it? However, I think it's probably an important resource that we do need some resilience, and we need to have a national resource for.
So would you support nationalisation?
If there's no other way, I think it's probably the least worst outcome.
No, they shouldn't shut it down. But nationalisation's not good either.
Well, Paul, former Conservative MP, former Conservative Minister, the Conservatives voted for, let's loosely call it, government control of steel up in Scunthorpe, what many say will evolve into nationalisation. Is nationalisation the right answer to the problem in Scunthorpe?
Long term, I don't think it is, but short term, I don't think you've got much choice, because actually I talked about the fact that there was no plan coming into this. They have a highly unionised workforce that hasn't really changed since the last discussion about this, when Jingyi first came in, the company that owns British Steel. We have the most expensive energy prices in the Western world. Those are the things that need to be addressed if we're going to come back to profitability. Otherwise, taxpayer, we don't know how much the taxpayer is going to be on the hook for, and of course we don't know if we're going to get it back to profitability. So long term, probably not.
Alicia, do you think there were any other options to sorting out Scunthorpe, saving Scunthorpe, when you like, than what the government did?
Well, I mean, as some of the public said in those very eloquent interviews, I thought, they were saying that the fact is that steel isn't a profitable industry in the UK. So finding someone else, another company, A, with the money to take over such a huge project, and B, who actually wants to invest their money in something that is effectively going to come at some kind of loss. Yes, fine, there are some benefits to it. Obviously, if you are a foreign investor, having your money somewhere in the UK, even if it is at a slight loss, might still see some benefits for you in terms of spreading your kind of wings, I suppose, and kind of getting some bases in different places. But overall, it's still a really, really hard bargain to actually pay. So realistically, in the time frame that the government had between realising how serious and how urgent this problem was versus that Saturday when Parliament was recalled, I think there probably was little option.
Vicky, you were a former government advisor. What would you be advising them?
Well, the interesting thing is that even before we got to the crunch where the government had to intervene in the way that it did, it was offering an awful lot of money to the British Steel, to the Chinese owners, to continue operating and sort of convert at some point, of course, to electric furnaces as well, so that we can meet some of the green requirements and also, move along with the times, if you like. So even if there is a private investor who comes in to this, they're going to expect and continue to expect for a while that there would be state involvement in terms of supporting them, both getting the materials and also the production process, and then selling Still, Paul mentioned the fact that energy costs are so high, electricity costs are so high in the energy-intensive sectors. Doing something about this, of course, if they reduce, somehow rather, if we manage to reduce that cost to the industry, then it's the rest of us perhaps who have to bear it.
But Paul, why on earth would a private investor want to come in and get involved in a steelworks in a country that has the highest energy costs, in part because of the government's own net zero policies? Why on earth would a private sector want to get involved? Isn't this nationalisation actually a sign of failure?
I think it probably is, and I think you're right to ask that question, because if you go back to when Jingyi, the Chinese company that owns British Steel at the moment, came in, they were the only bidder for this. We've nationalised British Steel a couple of times in the past. We've never successfully been able to find an investor to come in for the long term. We've had good companies like Tata that have tried and failed for the reasons, those underlying reasons that we've not been able to solve in this country yet.
Is this a turning point where people will not only just be looking, Alicia, at what's been happening at Scunthorpe, but actually saying, hang on, if we've got those highest energy costs in Europe, how can we have a manufacturing industry at all? You know, we're 80% higher than some of our competitors in Europe. Is it a turning point possibly even for net zero policies?
I mean, I think it's probably unlikely given how much Labour have spoken about net zero, although we did actually hear recently Keir Starmer slightly renege on his goal about electric vehicle rollout, so maybe a little bit of relaxation just based on the fact it just isn't feasibly possible in a way that's affordable to the public. But I do think any kind of significant U-turn is unlikely because this was a policy that Labour was so keen on, and net zero is something that was in their manifesto, so I think a U-turn would be quite controversial.
Vicky, the business proposition doesn't add up. What about the government's economic policies? They seem contradictory. We're going for growth. We are going to drive manufacturing. We want to support business and growth in this country and jobs. And at the same time, they have policies that are making it very hard for manufacturing businesses, not least these net zero policies. Something's got to give.
Well, yes, absolutely true. But of course, those policies do not just rest on the cost of producing in the UK by comparison to others, but also in terms of our trade relationships with Europe, for example. Where there is this attempt now to at least improve that a little bit, because particularly smaller firms, smaller manufacturing firms, smaller service firms have stopped trading with Europe because of the problems that exist and bureaucracy that exist.
You're talking about post-Brexit problems.
Yes, absolutely, post-Brexit in the last few years. And that has, of course, been affecting our growth potential as well. So you talked about this government going for growth. You can't get that unless you change the way in which we trade. And now, of course, with the tariff situation, it just makes it even more important that we should do that. But I think there is no doubt that a look at how, even for households, you calculate the electricity cost is something absolutely vital that needs to be done. Other countries don't do it. France, for example, of course, depends a lot on nuclear power, which is cheap. I mean, in terms of the extra unit that is produced, it costs hardly anything at all. And industry benefits hugely. And Germany, until relatively recently, also had the same benefit in terms of getting quite cheap energy from Russia.
So now, look, China's involvement in this, they were the owners, Paul. But what has since become clear, as the tension is on Chinese ownership, they've got a stake in an awful lot of our infrastructure, considering the state of relationships and trust that are not abounding in the world. China literally being seen on the one hand as the enemy by even Keir Starmer's government. At the same time, their energy secretary is out there trying to do deals to be ever closer with them. Are we ever going to be, if you like, secure so long as China has a huge stake in our infrastructure?
I think really, if you look at the comparison between David Cameron's leadership when he got very close to China, was encouraging
a golden age, he told us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And more recent times, I think we don't have similar values in terms of statehood. And so I think we've got to sup with a long spoon, have good relationships with trading relationships.
But is it
with
too
China.
late? 45 billion of investments by China in the United Kingdom.
I don't think it's too late, but I just think we have to be slightly cautious. And we've already got legislation in place. When I was tech minister, we put legislation in place to make sure that if there were things that might undermine our security in terms of semiconductors, in terms of things that could be used in defence, we would actually have a very close look at the security implications before selling off things. But I think what Donald Trump has done in America has actually strengthened China's hand in many ways, even though they have a precarious economy, and because people are going to look to, especially around the centre of gravity of China in Asia, where we were looking to pivot our trading relationship, that's going to be tougher because China is going to be sucking them in a little bit more.
China have this huge stake in us, but does it prompt, Alicia, that perhaps we should learn from this steel episode in Scunthorpe particularly, that it's time for a new identity for Britain? We shouldn't be trying to be a manufacturing nation if we can't afford to produce things cheap enough for people to sell and at the right quality.
It's true, but then that begs the question of what are we, you know? And this is what the government are really trying to grapple with. Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, said after this episode that it's now very much made us doubt our trust in China and Chinese investment within the country, and rightly so. Of course, a scenario like this is really going to change the way that we see foreign investors, but then it begs the question of what do we do without them, and that's something that successive governments have tried to grapple with and have all failed, which is why we're in this situation. So it would take a very big shift in ideology of what the UK actually is and what we are good at and what our global position is on the world for that to happen.
And is that shift possible, Vicky? Can you see the British landscape of business evolving and changing?
Yes, but what I think that this government is trying to do is have loads of agreements and trade agreements with countries further afield. So the Indian trade deal, which we've been trying to do for ages, which actually isn't happening because the other side has been pretty difficult in terms of allowing service firms in particular getting into the country.
And that's the biggest part, to be clear, the service sector is the biggest part of our economy, isn't it?
And it's where we have a surplus, in fact, ourselves, even with the US, which President Trump hasn't quite realised.
I mean, Paul, this is something that's been grappled with for a long time, is, what should Britain's, if you like, industrial and business landscape? We've had industrial strategy after industrial strategy launched. At the end of the day, how successful can any government be in resetting the landscape that business operates on?
I think it is all about landscape. Ultimately, it's business that create wealth, it's business that create jobs. So all we can do is set that landscape. And it is difficult, but you've got to listen to the businesses themselves in the first place. You can't take a politically dogmatic view from Number 10 or in Whitehall and then expect that to roll out and businesses to actually listen to you. They're looking the other way. They're looking at their bottom line. They're looking around the rest of the world and who they can trade with.
Alicia, fundamentally, we've seen this huge massive intervention by the government on the steelworks. Is this actually something we might see more of now from a Labour government?
Well, I mean, I'm sure lots of members of the public would definitely hope so, because it really did prove that if there is political will to change something, to do something quickly, it can actually be done. I think lots of the public are fed up of hearing from politicians that there just isn't the political time to sort something that's really pressing. Sorry, Paul, no offence. And that, it's going to be kind of kicked down the line and not seen as a priority. But I think that this really did show that if there is something that everyone collectively agrees is urgent and needs changing, then it can definitely be done quickly.
Is the age of free markets dead? I mean, look, steelworks, why should anyone support something that is not working?
Steelworks has not been free for a market for years and years
exactly.
and years. I mean, China produces more steel than the next top 10 countries combined, and they've been dumping steel, which is why tariffs have come up, including from Britain, for some time now to try and avoid that. It's a broken market.
Is it a broken market that's happened principally because of President Trump? Do you think this problem would have happened?
I think he's broken it further.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, in terms of how far can you intervene and do something about it, and you talked about whether the free market is over. It isn't just the free trade across nations. It's also what happens within this country. There is a lot more government interference. I mean, the interesting thing is that this government has been talking about reducing regulations and easing sort of the business environment. At the same time, of course, it's now intervening a lot more in in business, and it's going to have to continue to do so. The real
Why
concern,
is it going to have to continue to
because
do so?
there are all these pressures out there. President Trump, up to a point, what's going on with China more generally, the geopolitics, they need to do a lot more in defense. We have to spend an awful lot more than we had anticipated. The world economy is slowing down, so you're going to have to step in. The interesting thing for me is that we're quite slow in terms of moving in the direction of trying to help businesses, but also, what you have is the need to spend an awful lot more in a number of areas, which are going to affect quite considerably how much money the government needs to borrow and how much money it has to spend on it. So the pressures are going to be quite significant in terms of how do you square the two things, needing to intervene more to support the economy because the world economy is slowing down due to all these things that are happening. And how can you afford to do that, particularly right now, where the interest rate on our bonds is going up rather than down?
And that is a huge question that I'm sure we'll be talking about, not least because the government's big spending review is coming up, and we'll see exactly how bad the books are once again. Thanks very much indeed to Vicky, Pryce, Paul Scully and Alicia Fitzgerald for joining me here today on Westminster Watch. Indeed, thanks again to all my guests for joining me, and don't forget to connect with us on X at Westminster TRT. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.